Even quiet back there in the peanut gallery, please. How are you all tonight? It's great to be out seeing people again in public and having a book to talk about. Last night we were at the Cape, we had a nice audience there, and here is another nice audience. It's just, it's like real life again. And what I wanted to talk with you about tonight was my 12th novel. 12 novels, one award-winning documentary on the life of George Washington, and one of the cheesiest horror movies of all time.
What was it called?
It was called Humanoids from the Deep. Starred Vic Morrow, Doug McClure, Ann Turkel, and a bunch of guys in rubber suits who come up out of the ocean in Northern California and terrorize the town of, I can't think of the name of the town now. They terrorize a town, a generic fishing village. That's all we're not going to talk about humanoids, though. Although it is a scary thought that probably more people have seen that movie than have read all of my books in my whole life. And it was, as I just read about a year ago, it was the second highest grossing movie of the summer of 1980, after The Empire Strikes Back.
Whoa.
And I didn't have a nickel of it. But maybe the most commonly asked question of any writer is, where do you get your ideas from? And for me, they've come from many different sources and from many different directions. You know, I always talk about the bolt of lightning, or the buried fossil, or the brilliant insight in a beautiful place, or the bright first line, or the bolt of lightning. I once got an idea from a bumper sticker. It said, bequeath thy kidneys. And I said to myself, and then to my wife, who was sitting next to me, now sitting at the back there, what would happen if somebody got an organ transplant and they became fascinated by the donor, and they started tracking the donor's life, and by the end of the novel, they found themselves in the same situation that the donor had been in at the beginning of the novel. And out of that grew a book called Nerve Endings, which was my second novel. Bright first lines. Once I was so stumped, I was just sitting at my desk writing down first lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, sounded too familiar. Call me Ishmael. Who would ever name a main character Ishmael? And then I wrote the lines, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, which is the opening lines of Catholic confession. And out of that grew a scene, and out of that scene grew a novel called The Rising of the Moon. The brilliant insight in the beautiful place. All those times I sat and looked out on Cape Cod Bay when I was a kid, at the age of 12, thinking to myself, there's a story out here. There are many stories out here in this wide bay, and someday I'm going to tell them. And I did, eventually. And of course, the buried fossil, the Back Bay story, which was planted in my head when I was in the 4th grade at the Robert Gould Shaw School in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, where the teacher told us about the filling of the Back Bay and how the city had grown out over that mud flat. And I thought to myself as I was listening to her, and this may sound apocryphal, but it was true, I thought to myself, what if there's buried treasure down under those buildings, down in that landfill? And 20 years later, when nobody wanted to produce my screenplays, I trotted that idea out and wrote a book called Back Bay. For December 41, the idea came in a movie theater downtown, a crowded Boston movie theater, on the site of the old Astor Theater on Tremont Street, which is on the site, by the way, for those of you who are really interested in history, of the first legal theater in the city of Boston, which didn't open until 1792. It's that, you know the name, I can't think of the name of the theater now, but it's right across from the Common. we were watching the movie Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. And Churchill, about halfway through the movie, goes down into the basement of his headquarters, the deepest abyss of his headquarters, where there is a hotline from him to Washington, D.C. The Germans are advancing in Dunkirk. France is about to fall. Britain is about to stand alone against the Nazi onslaught. And he calls Roosevelt and asks him for help. And Roosevelt tells him that he can't help because his hands are tied by the difficulties of American politics, the requirements of neutrality. And Churchill hangs up and slumps, believes he's not going to get any help at all, and he bows his head, and the camera cuts to a long shot of him. And I thought to myself, he looks so depressed, so terrible. But in a year and a half after Pearl Harbor, he's going to go to Washington, and he's going to stand on the south portico of the White House on Christmas Eve, right next to Franklin Roosevelt, as Roosevelt lights the Christmas tree, and together they will express the unity of the Allies in this great crusade that they are about to engage in. And then I thought, while the movie was still unraveling, and what a target they will make. And I had it. I said, oh yes. By the time the movie was over, we went to dinner, and I told Chris all about this, and I said, this is what I'm going to do next. And you need an idea that excites you, and this one excited me. I also needed to prove to myself that there was some basis in reality for something like this, because you know, if you've read any of my books, that I don't change history. George Washington doesn't act in any way unlike the George Washington of history. Abraham Lincoln is Abraham Lincoln, and Booth gets him at the end of the Lincoln letter. So you know that nobody is going to take a shot at FDR and Churchill on Christmas Eve of 1941. So my job, of course, will be to put you into the hearts and minds of the characters who are fictional as they run along in tandem with the unfolding history. But I still need to make it believable. So, were they worried about assassinations at the beginning of the war? I started digging through the footnote food chain in a couple of works of history that explore this period, and I found a reference to a book called Riley of the White House. Riley of the White House is a book written by Mike Riley, who was the senior agent in charge of the Secret Service detail that protected Franklin Roosevelt during the whole unfolding of the war. He was Roosevelt's elbow man, as they called him, the man who was always at FDR's side, because of course FDR, being handicapped, could not evade any kind of an attack. And of course he was deathly afraid of fire, because if he was caught in a bed, the house was on fire, the White House or someplace else, he had to have somebody to pick him up and carry him out. So Mike Riley, in about 1947, wrote a very short and fairly obscure volume about the history of his time in the White House. And in it, he described the concerns of the various security agencies charged with protecting the president right after Pearl Harbor.